Thomas the tank engine was in a foul temper. The island of Sodor had recently been hit hard by a fierce storm, and the Fat Controller had advised all of his engines, many that were available, to work as hard as they could and help clear up the mess. Thomas seethed with rage. Harvey had already made him late, and waiting for Henry to pass through the junction made him later still. "Silly big engines, silly weather," grumbled Thomas. "Nothing's gonna perk me up today." But Thomas reckoned without Molly. Molly, the large yellow tender engine, was helping Edward in the valley. Leaves had blown across the line, and Molly and Edward were working as hard as they could to try and make sure the tracks were clear so that the engines wouldn't slip on the leaves. "God, this is tiring," exclaimed Molly. "I hope everyone's going to be in a better mood when the storm lifts." "The weather changes an engine's appearance completely, my dear," advised Edward. "I've seen engines go into a fit of rage when the first storm cloud bursts." "Is it that bad?" asked Molly meekly. "Many engines do get over it," said Edward wisely. "But some, well, just be careful, Molly. You'll be surprised what storms can do." Edward then went to fetch a breakdown gang to clear up the rest of the leaves, while Molly went to fetch some trucks from the yards to take them away. As Molly made her way to the yard, she found Bill and Ben looking very bothered. The twins had double-headed a long line of stone trucks from the clay pits to take to the docks. The weather had not been too kind to them at all. "If you had buckled up at the back, we wouldn't have been in this dilemma," huffed Bill. "You wanted to double-head, so I insisted we double-head," Ben retorted. "Is there something I can help with?" asked Molly, trying to offer her services. No, we're all right, thank you," said Ben in a rather sheepish voice. "Suit yourself," sighed Molly, and she puffed away. Bill and Ben did struggle with the train, but only moved at a crawl. Before long, Molly arrived at the yard to collect some trucks. She was worried that she was keeping Edward. Some trucks nearby giggled rudely at her.
"Look, the sun's come out!"
They laughed.
"It's sunshine, Molly!"
"All right, that's enough," called a voice. Molly almost jumped, but she was pleased when James pulled in. "James, you startled me," exclaimed Molly. "Sorry about that," James called. "These trucks have been playing up all afternoon." James then noticed that Molly looked miserable. "What's the matter?" he asked. "It's this storm," said Molly. "It's made everyone miserable. I wish there was something I could do." "The trucks make a good point," said James, admiring Molly's coat of paint. "You do look like the sun. Maybe that's what we're missing. You can spread some summer joy to the other engines." Molly hadn't thought of it like that. James's idea could just work. She thanked him and set off back to the valley to find Edward. Molly had soon dropped off her trucks to Edward and was making her way back. Edward was feeling much better having seen her and was thankful. As Molly made her way back to the yard, she saw Thomas in the distance. Thomas was still rather annoyed with the storm, but as soon as Molly whistled brightly at him and passed by showing her yellow coat of paint, Thomas felt much better at once. "Who needs the sunshine when we've got you, Molly?" he beamed, and Thomas whistled thank you. Molly felt much better. Before long, the valley was leaf-free and the Fat Controller was very pleased with Molly and Edward. He was also pleased with all of the engines, from Harvey to Thomas to Henry to almost everyone who had managed to pull through the storm, regardless of how much destruction it had left behind. When evening came, Molly was pulling a passenger train to wrap up the day's work. She was already feeling in much better spirits than she had been earlier that day. As Molly passed through Callan Castle, a gorgeous sight awaited her. The dark clouds that had covered Sodor all day had since burst into rich blue sky, and to Molly's delight, even a rainbow had appeared. I guess James was right, Molly puffed to herself. I am sunshine after all. And with that thought in mind, Molly sped down the line to deliver her passengers, pleased that not only the storm had finally ended, but just like everyone else, she had worked hard like a really useful engine. Duke awoke from what he thought was the best sleep he had had in years. He had just been brought to the Scarlowy Railway after being buried in a shed on his old railway for many years. Duke loved the feeling of the warm afternoon sun shining down on him. He had also received a visit from Peter Sam and Sir Handel, who during the days of the Mid-Sodor, where Duke used to work, were known as Falcon and Stuart. As Duke gave a great yawn, he was beginning to wonder what was in store for him for his new working life on the little railway. There was one little engine who was curious about Duke's past, and that was Scarlowy. A few months after Duke had settled, he spoke to Peter Sam. I'm always curious to know how you, Duke and Sir Handel worked well together on the Mid-Sodor, he said. Well, Duke knows all about the railway more than me and Sir Handel do, said Peter Sam. It wouldn't hurt to ask him. Oh, I wouldn't want to bother him, said Scarlowy. After all, I'm much older than he is. He'll probably think of me as some nosy Parker trying to intervene on his work. He'll be coming back this evening, said Peter Sam. You can ask him then. Scarlowy still didn't feel certain, but Peter Sam had already puffed away to do his work. Scarlowy started to ponder. Was it worth asking Duke about the old days? That he would find out himself. True to Peter Sam's word, Duke returned later that evening. Scarlowy had been in the shed since the afternoon. He had been acting as relief and was waiting for a call to go and help an engine in need. Duke could tell that Scarlowy was noticing him and smiled. How are you, Scarlowy? He asked. Never better, thank you, replied Scarlowy. Duke, I was talking to Peter Sam and I was wondering, could you tell me about the Mid-Sodor? Duke smiled warmly. I was wondering how long it would be before one of you asked, he puffed. Duke started by telling Scarlowy how he saved Falcon, who Sir Handel was known as at the time, from nearly falling off the mountain road. He then recalled the time that he needed the help of Falcon and Stuart, who Peter Sam was then known as, with a picnic train, only to have his strength return when Stuart single-handedly tried to take him to the top station. Duke even told Scarlowy about his life on the Mid-Sodor long before Stuart and Falcon came to work there. Long before Stuart and Falcon came, Duke said, we had a lot of engines on the Mid-Sodor. There was John, Jennings, Atlas, he worked in the mines, and old Jim. Many engines came and went, but some would say that I outlasted them all. Smudger, our former number 2, he suffered the most when his rough riding cost him a trip to the back of the shed as a generator. Some engines don't know the respect of their crews and their care, snorted Scarlowy. Duke fondly agreed and continued with his story. Another engine I remember greatly, he said, was old Tim. He supported me during the railway's opening. He was a kind-hearted engine, always full of life and never afraid to take on anything that came his way.
Don't you worry about a thing, Duke.
He would say.
I got this. All you need is a nice rest.
I was always pleased when Tim supported me. Such a good engine at heart. The others were okay. Jim suffered bad luck from time to time. Jennings was quick on his wheels. John could memorize every single train before it was taken out. And Atlas knew the mines like the back of my buffers, if I had any. Scar Loey was amazed as Duke finished his story. Before long, a relief call came in for Scar Loey. He thanked Duke for his stories and set off to retrieve Sir Handel, who of course had derailed near Krosny Curran. But Scar Loey hadn't been the only one listening to Duke's stories. Thomas's driver had been visiting a friend who was working on the little railway and had heard everything. As he went back to Thomas, who was waiting at Croghansgate Station with Annie and Clarabelle, he was delighted. "You'll never guess what I've just heard, Thomas," he said, and he told him what he heard. "So Duke does exist," exclaimed Thomas. "Who would have thought it?" Thomas took Annie and Clarabelle back to the yards and headed towards the shed. "This is just what the engines will need after a long day, especially with the winter storm coming," he puffed. And Thomas thought about the stories of Duke and the Mid-Sodor Railway all the way home.